Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to IDG Live. This is a pre-recorded live stream about the Second Age of Middle-earth. So this is a Lord of the Rings live stream. Pre-recorded means if you are there in the chat watching this live, I've set it up as a premiere, the chat will be there. Enjoy yourselves as normal. Obviously, though, I will not be able to answer your questions direct. If you do pop some questions there, super chats or anything like that, then I will try and pick them up next time, but I obviously cannot do it this time. So, the Second Age of Middle-earth. It's a long age, 3,500 years, or thereabouts, and it starts, I've got questions I'll come on to, but let's do an overview. It starts very much in the shadow of what happened at the end of the First Age of Middle-earth. At the end of the First Age, Morgoth, Melkor, the kind of big antagonist in Tolkien's world, he was fighting a huge battle against the forces of, not just the forces of good, but this was the Valar themselves sent the army of the Valar over to go and take on Morgoth. There was a huge battle that took decades. It was called the War of Wrath. And this was so huge that the whole Beleriand, that whole part of Middle-earth, ended up being sunken under the sea. Morgoth was defeated. And at the end of this age, a few of Morgoth's lieutenants, key supporters, managed to scatter off into the far reaches of Middle-earth. But most of his army, most of his infrastructure, most of what he had built was gone. The elves who were there, they got called Eonwë, who's the herald of Manwë. He called the elves back once more to go to Aman, to go to the Blessed Realm, and a lot of them did respond to that. There were, however, quite a few who decided, you know what, I want to stay in Middle-earth. They migrated east over the Blue Mountains and started to set up home in what we know as the map of Middle-earth. Also, the humans, the three races of human, the Edain, who had supported the elves, fought against Morgoth, they were rewarded by the Valar, by the creation of Númenor, this island continent. And over a period of time, they all migrated over to there, and this was their land now from then on. They had a few rules that they had to live by. Most notably, they could sail, but they could not sail westwards, out of sight of their land, because westwards is the Blessed Realm, and they were not allowed to go to the Blessed Realm. That was not for them, that was for the elves. So that's the kind of the setup that we have going on. As the Second Age starts, therefore, we have a continent just repairing itself, trying to figure out where the new balances of power lie. And the elves, just to start out there, we have a new High King of the Noldor, of the Elves of the West, Gil-galad. He sets himself up in Lindon, towards the west of Middle-earth. We have a few other ancient elves who are there. Círdan, who establishes himself at what we know as the Grey Havens. This is when he sets himself up there and is making the boats for any elves who want to head west. So throughout this age, into the Third Age, there is this trickle of elves who can still head on the straight road, the straight path, off to Valinor. We also get people like Galadriel, who we will talk a lot more about in a moment, but she and her husband Celeborn, they kind of range around for a little while before finding themselves first in Eregion, then they head down to Belfalas. They also Galadriel spends a little bit of time in Lothlorien. But probably the most important thing to note about the elves is that whereas we had previously, if you're looking in the Silmarillion, if you're thinking about the story of the elves in the Silmarillion, this was mostly about the elves who, the Noldor, and the elves who had either come back from come back from the Blessed Realm, or who had nearly got there, and those are the elves that we're talking about. Now, however, we're dealing with a whole load of the elves who, when they were first called west, they kind of said no, or they went a little bit of the way and didn't go any further. So we've got the elves who are hanging out in places like Mirkwood. It wasn't called Mirkwood at the time, it was called Greenwood the Great. They are elves who kind of went part of the way west and then decided, you know what, we kind of like it here. So we get a lot of elves who are left there in Middle-earth, and we get mixing of the elves. Some elves who've gone to the Blessed Realm and come back, some elves who didn't quite go there in the first place, some elves who wanted to go and couldn't for various reasons. So we get a whole load of mixing of elves. The humanity, men, are now in two broad places. We have Númenor, this island kingdom, who we will talk about in just one moment, that's going to grow to be incredibly powerful. And then we have the men, the humans, who had stayed in Middle-earth and hadn't fought against Morgoth. And they were sort of still under the shadow. Because it's worth pointing out that the bit of Middle-earth that we're talking about here, the bit that we see on the map, is really just kind of like the northwest of Middle-earth. There's far more of Middle-earth down to the east and to the south. Rhûn is what we think of as being to the east. Rhûn just means east. It's just like all of that bit over there. It's much bigger than the part that we're looking at as well. All of that area had, by and large, fallen under the shadow of Morgoth. So they're still there. They're low men, as it were. The high men are the people there on Númenor. The dwarves are obviously still around. The dwarves in their 7 tribes. We get 2 of them in the Blue Mountains on the west of the map. We get the Longbeards, Durin's folk under the Misty Mountains, and then we get the other 4 who are off the map to the east and the south. And as this age starts to kind of draw on, the first few years are just the establishment of these new kingdoms. Everybody knows that a few of the remnants of Morgoth's forces and supporters are still out there, particularly Sauron. We will talk about him a bit more in a moment as well. He bent the knee at the end of the war and said that he was willing to head west and face judgment, but then changed his mind and went off into hiding. So everybody knows that Sauron is out there somewhere, but he is quiet for quite a long time. There's also at least 1 Balrog who escapes, possibly 2. I did a video on that if you're interested about how many Balrogs there might be out there, because it might not be the number you're thinking. There's at least 1 Balrog out there, although they don't have any impact at all in the Second Age. And there are some dragons, which we'll talk about in a moment, who also managed to escape, and orcs. Orcs, they probably not in huge numbers, but in growing numbers, did manage to survive through, some of them into the Second Age. So that's the kind of the broad picture. I think one thing to pick out, because it will be important as we get through the Second Age, is that we get the founding of Eregion. Some of these elves, led by Celebrimbor, who is the grandson of Feanor, the greatest, most powerful of the Noldor, but also quite a troubled figure. his grandson Celebrimbor established a community, an elf community, just west of the Misty Mountains, and he established a strong relationship with the dwarves of the Misty Mountains. This was so good and strong as a trading relationship that when you look, if you'll remember the west gate of Moria, that even says, this was built by Celebrimbor and Navi. This was built by elves and dwarves, and it's often overlooked but hugely important. We always think, speak, friend, and enter. We don't actually stop and think, what does this mean? This gate here, the western side of the of Moria, is in huge comparison to the one on the east side. On the east gate, there are runes holding everybody back. The dwarves are stopping anybody coming in. On the west gate, in order to get the gates to open, all you have to do is say in Elvish, friend, and the gates will open. If you're an elf and you say you're a friend, you can come in. No questions asked, you can come in. This is a completely different vibe from what we've got over on the east side of Moria, and it shows that this is the height of friendship between elves and dwarves. So they really bond. Celebrimbor was a great craftsman, so they really bond over crafting. There's a whole load of excellent work that goes on there. With Mithril, but the key point is that is a strong relationship between elves and dwarves, that the like of which we do not see again until we get to Gimli and Legolas. So 500 years go past, and this will be a theme actually as we're going through an overview of the Second Age. Hundreds of years go by. If I'm not going to mention it much, but the Rings of Power, one of the things that they did on that TV show was really contract the timeline. So some things which happen in the Rings of Power in a matter of seemingly a few days or weeks, when you go back to the books, these things take centuries. So when you're thinking about the Second Age, think massive periods of time. Things happen slowly, and that at a kind of a meta level works with one of the key themes of this age, because what this is about aging. And the elves are staying eternal, while the humans, the Númenorians, are not. They grow old and die. And it is noticing those two things over a long period of time that starts to create tensions. But anyway, 500 years into the Second Age, we start to hear the first signs of a shadow rising in the east. A little bit after this, we get Aldarion, who is, at the time, he's a prince of Númenor. He starts sailing out from Númenor. Númenor has established itself as this great, it's sort of like industrial. Tolkien didn't really like industrial, but this was basically what it was. The technology that they were developing there was going to reach the pinnacle of what humanity could ever do. And finally, they started exploring out beyond their island continent. And Aldarion is the first of these great explorers. And he goes and he makes contact with the elves. And this is actually the only full story, not quite full. He didn't completely finish it, but pretty much full story that Tolkien wrote about the Second Age is about Aldarion, the Mariner's Wife, it's called. You can find it in Unfinished Tales. It's beautiful, quite sad, but a beautiful story. And he establishes contact with the elves, and Gil-galad starts to get this feeling about there's a rising evil in this world, and he sort of like lets the Númenorians know about this. We get told that this is both too soon and too late, in as much as it was too soon because nobody was really ready to do anything about it. They just had a few hundred years of peace, and they couldn't see much going on. But it was also too late because it was too late to really nip it in the bud. So Gil-galad here in the books is very foresighted. He can see that things are going on, but it's quite hard to know exactly what you do about this, because they don't know that this is Sauron at this point. However, by the year 1000, Sauron starts to establish himself in Mordor. He we'll get into exactly what he was up to in those first 1,000 years, but he takes a look round and he decides, I need a home base. Where shall I have my home base? It clearly can't be right up in the middle of where all the elves are. It clearly can't be over like in this new island continent with the humans, with the Númenorians. So I'll be a little bit away. Mordor is there, very sheltered, mountains around three sides of it. It's already got this mountain, volcanic mountain. He's a smith, and he loves the idea of being able to craft things in that kind of volcano. And also the ash does create this kind of cloud cover that means that he could start to build up an orc army, an army of people who do not like the light. So that starts at about the year 1000. He starts building Barad-dûr, the great tower, and we often don't think about it as such. I did in my video, the Seven Wonders of Middle-earth. I put Barad-dûr as one of those seven wonders because this was huge. This took 650 years to build. It was the tallest built structure in the entirety of Middle-earth. It was almost unbeatable. If we cut forward to the end of this, when Sauron fell, the Gondorians could break down the tower, but they could not get rid of the foundations, so strong they were. This was an astonishing feat of engineering. But after a couple of 100 years, Sauron's looking round and he comes up with a plan. He decides he's going to try and take down the elves because Sauron wants to control. We'll get into this bit, as I say, we've got more to talk about Sauron in a moment, but we'll get into the fact that Sauron isn't just a stereotypical baddie who just wants to conquer for conquering's sake. He thinks that Middle-earth needs to be ruled with a strong and an iron fist, and he thinks that he is probably the best placed person to do that. And I was going to say, to be fair to Sauron, that's probably not the right way we should treat Sauron, but from his perspective, he probably thinks he is, and he probably actually is, the most powerful being in Middle-earth. The Valar aren't there and aren't coming back. This is before we get any of the other, the Astari. They don't arrive. There's a small asterisk. So that, again, I will come back. They don't arrive until the Third Age. But yes, there's probably a Balrog or so hanging out, but he was Morgoth's chief lieutenant. He was his right-hand man. He's thinking to himself, I'm the most powerful being here. I'm the person who is best placed to create this order. So anyway, the way he thinks of doing this is to control the elves, who clearly they wouldn't be up for this. So that's where he disguises himself as Anatar around the year 1200. And he heads up to the elves and says that he is the Lord of Gifts. He is there providing gifts from the Valar. In his mind, the Valar have disappeared. They've gone. They're not coming back. So he thinks he's on safe ground, saying, oh, I'm here presenting gifts on behalf of the Valar. The wise, by which we mean Gil-galad, Elrond, Galadriel as well, they're a little... They suspect something. They don't know. They do not know that this is Sauron, but there's something that just like sets off their spidey sense, and they go, no, you can't come here. However, when we get to Celebrimbor and co. in Eregion, they welcome him because they want to stay in Middle-earth, and he is offering wisdom on, in particular, how do they create the atmosphere, as it were, the right conditions within Middle-earth that will allow them to stay. Because the big problem that the elves have is that they are immortal. We're going slightly meta with Tolkien here, but this is where he went with it. The elves are immortal. They live forever. They are tied to Arda. They are tied to this planet. And the what works for them is the Undying Lands. Lands that carry on, that are endless, that are undying. Middle-earth is not like that. Middle-earth has this constant cycle of birth and death and rebirth. The people around them, dwarves and humans and everyone else, they're born and they die. Friendships are lost. Trees grow. Rivers cut their way through the landscape. The landscape itself shifts, and the elves remain immortal through all of that. And over time, that starts to get wearying for the elves. However, what they wanted, what a number of the elves who stayed in Middle-earth wanted, was to be able to protect themselves and their local environment against the ravages of time, to create an environment within Middle-earth that allowed them to be what they thought that they were, which is like the top of the tree. This is the way that Tolkien describes it. They thought they were like top of the pecking order, the most important, most powerful people in Middle-earth. They wanted to be able to do that whilst creating an environment that worked for them. So Sauron, as Anatar, comes in and basically says, I can do this. I can show you how to preserve things, how to protect things. Let's do this by crafting some magical rings. And so that's what he does. And this takes now, again, hundreds of years, 300 years, where they go through this period of creating what Gandalf later calls essays in the craft, minor magical rings, which, as a complete aside, that's probably what Gandalf first thought that Bilbo's ring was, one of these minor magical rings, an essay in the craft that clearly has power, and you should clearly take it seriously, but it's not one of the great rings of power. He's there for 300 years, at the end of which they create these 16 rings of power, which augment your own power and also have the ability to kind of like extend life and things like that. So just as a clarification here, we sometimes talk about the 9 and the 7. We got the 9 for mortal men and the 7 for the dwarf lords. That wasn't the plan. Sauron wanted them created for the elves. The idea was that the elves would have them, the elves would put on those rings, then he would sneak away to Mordor, create the master ring and have control over all of those. He would be able to see their thoughts and he would be able to control them by having this master ring. Cunning plan. What could possibly go wrong? So these 16 rings of power have been created. He nips off back to Mordor, and Celebrimbor kind of like getting a little bit frustrated here, like, my friend's gone, but he did show me how to make these rings of power. I'll make some more. So he makes the 3 elven rings. So the best way to understand this is that they use the same magical technology as Sauron, as the original 16. They are therefore kind of linked, but they are not corrupted by Sauron's touch, because Sauron never had contact with those 3 elven rings. So if you go forward in time and you see Galadriel and Elrond in the Third Age, in the main Lord of the Rings story, the reason why Lothlorien and Rivendell are so idyllic, are so sort of ethereal, apart from the rest of the world, as if they're holding back the ravages of time, is because of the power of those rings. That's what is going on there. So Celebrimbor created those 3 rings. Then we get another, well, it takes about 100 years. Again, huge periods of time before Barad-dûr is finished finally, and then the One Ring is forged. Sauron finally forges this One Ring, and when he creates it and puts on this One Ring, he thinks he's going to get power over the elves. But the elves, he clearly underestimated them. The elves go, "Whoa, who's this? Take off the ring." And Celebrimbor suddenly realizes what has happened, and he goes off and he talks to Galadriel and says, "What do we do? I've got these three here. Those 16 clearly that they're not good. These three I made without him having any involvement. What do we do with them?" And Galadriel advises him to get them out and keep them secret and protected. And so they end up. Galadriel obviously has one. Gil-galad gets two. One of them goes to One of them, when he dies, goes down to Elrond. One of them goes to Círdan. Círdan gives him eventually to Gandalf. So that's how they end up there. So Sauron's plan did not work. And so he goes, okay, plan B. I will go and get those rings back, and I will see whether I can give them to somebody else. That clearly I can't control the elves through these rings, but maybe I can control other people. And he launches an invasion, but again, a long period of time. This is the year 1693 when he starts his invasion. So this is 93 years after the One Ring was forged. He's built up his army, and then he goes in. And this is a long campaign. It takes 4 years before he gets to Eregion. And at Eregion, he attacks. Now, Celebrimbor and co, they have allies. The dwarves come out. We've already mentioned the fact that the dwarves were strong allies with Celebrimbor. They come out to help. Gil-galad sends his right-hand man Elrond with a force to come and support as well. Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, seems to be there too. But Sauron wins this battle. The dwarves get a victory, but they get pushed back, and the dwarves shut the gates of Moria, and they don't have much more to do with the story for the rest of the Second Age, to be honest. They do things. They keep on mining. The Khazad-dûm grows in power and strength and beauty and many other wonderful ways. But because the story we read about from the Silmarillion is very elf-focused, and the dwarves aren't there dealing much with the elves, we know a lot less about what's going on with them. Elrond also fights well, but has to fight this rearguard action and has to retreat. And he retreats to this valley that he then fortifies and defends. And that valley is Imladris, which later becomes known as Rivendell. Sauron pushes forward. He keeps on going. He starts to head all the way westwards. He's going to the heartland of the elves. He knows King Gil-galad. He's up in Lindon. So he keeps on going. But at this point, the Númenorians respond to a call. They are, at this time, still in their prime, and they are strong allies with Gil-galad, and they come and answer the call and push Sauron and his armies all the way back to Mordor. Which is quite humbling for Sauron, but he did achieve the main thing that he was after, which was that he did manage to get those 16 rings. He's annoyed and will remain annoyed all the way through the rest of his story with the fact that he missed out on those 3 rings that Celebrimbor made without him. He knows that they're powerful rings. He does not know exactly where they are. He suspects. He thinks he knows where they are, but he does not know exactly where they are. But he's got his 16 rings back. And over the course of the whatever time period, we're not exactly told, he distributes those rings. So 7 he gives to the dwarves. This number matches up obviously with the 7 dwarven tribes. So the clear implication is that each of those tribes gets that their king, their lord, gets a ring, and those dwarves dig greedily, deeply, and Sauron again finds that he does not have control over those rings because the dwarves, he made these for elves, and dwarves' minds, they're different. He cannot control them. The power of the ring is still there. It does take over the dwarf who wears it. And in the long term, it's pretty bad. They build up these stockpiles of gold and other things that they've managed to accumulate over the time. And eventually the dragons, when we're moving on into the Third Age, dragons and a Balrog, as we all know, decide we're going to come in and take this. So most of those rings, eventually they stay with the dwarves until dragons eat the people wearing them. The 9 rings that we think of as the rings for mortal men, he does distribute to 9 men. Now, we're not told exactly who they are. We know 4. We know that 3 of them are Númenorians, and we know that one of them is Camul the Easterling. And that's pretty much it. The implication is, therefore, that the others must have come from scattered parts of Middle-earth. It kind of makes sense that he put these out to the various parts where humanity is, and gave power to influential humans, and those humans wore them, and they became hugely powerful in becoming lords, becoming sorcerers, and eventually, though, after a long period of time, their lives extended, their lives stretched, and eventually, though, they became wraith-like. Because Sauron discovered that humans can be a lot more easily controlled through these rings than either elves or dwarves. And by the year 2251, the Nazgul appear. Now, who are these? Well, that's pretty much all we know. We've got the 3 Númenorians, and we've got the 6 from elsewhere, including one who was an Easterling. The Nazgul don't really have a huge, although they will play a role. I'm sure that they're there in Sauron's army and they're doing influential stuff through most of the Second Age. We're not told huge amounts about the specifics of what they're up to during the rest of the Second Age, but they are there and they will have been very important. And it's probably worth noting that Tolkien gave us the headlines of what happened in the Second Age. It's very clear that there are some moments that we get quite a lot of information about, but then hundreds of years go by and we're just sort of given a very brief overview. Here are the names of the kings and like a couple of lines about what each of those kings were, that kind of thing. So we get then a period of about 1,000 years. When Númenor grows in even more strength. They had started, we already mentioned with Eldarion, he had started the ships heading out, exploring out into, but they could head north and east and south. They just couldn't head west. And they started, first of all, establishing little trading ports on the coast. And then after a while, they turned them into fortresses. And after a while, they turned those fortresses into proper settlements. And the Númenorians were growing stronger and stronger. And their kind of magical technology that they had on Númenor itself was incredibly powerful. But as this was happening, also there's this kind of fall of the Númenorians. They had been set up, they had been established as being the pinnacle of humanity. They had contact with the elves, and the sort of the structure was built around acknowledgement and worship of Eru and the Valar, and to the extent to which the only real religion or religious ceremony that we hear about is climbing the mountain Meneltama in the middle, on particular feast days, and that as a sort of a silent worship of Eru, witnessed by giant eagles who were there, the messengers of Manwë. But slowly over time, humanity's pride grew, and this kind of lingering resentment against the elves, because although the Númenorians were very long-lived, the elves just carried on living. And humans, generation after generation after generation, they started to grow jealous of this. And the elves, it started moving away from we're in constant contact and allies and friends, to a point where by the year 3255, so again, we're now over 3 millennia into the Second Age. By this point, elves had been banned. Elvish had been banned. The king was always referred to as Tar, which is an Elvish honorific, and then that changed to Ar, which is purely human. So the language Elvish was banned, and there's a whole host of these kind of small things that kind of you can see that Tolkien's put in there. This has been abandoned, that has been abandoned, and it's this descent to the point where we have almost civil war within Númenor between what are known as the King's Men, who are those who are on the side of the king, because the kings, there was a clear turning point when the kings themselves turned their back on Eru, on the Valar, on the elves. The King's Men, who were in the majority, and the faithful, the minority, who still wished to stay true to the old ways. When Pharazôn took power, in a coup, it has to be said, he wasn't the heir, he took power in a coup. This meant that Númenor was at simultaneously the height of its power in terms of strength as a nation state, but also the lowest point that it had been at thus far in terms of relations with the elves, and how it stood with the Valar and with Eru. And Pharazôn, the Golden, not a humble moniker, it has to be said. He seizes the scepter, and he quite soon in his reign he launches an attack on Sauron, who for 1,000 years or so had been staying in Mordor. We don't really hear too much about him in this time. He's staying in Mordor, but he's expanding his kingdom basically off to the sort of the east and the south, and the vast bit of the map that we don't really know huge amounts about, and he's starting to basically set himself up as a god emperor of sorts. And the Númenorians didn't like that. They wanted to be the power, and they'd got places like Pelargir, these enclaves which are very close to Mordor, and so they go on the offensive. And Sauron resists for a while, but eventually he gives himself up. And you can read around what Tolkien says about this, but it's very clear that this isn't just Sauron going, "Oh, you beat me. There's nothing I can do," and heading off. He allowed himself to be taken capture. And he gets taken capture by the Númenorians and put in a prison cell. But over the course of the next 50 years or so, he slowly works his way up from the very bottom, using his smooth words, using his influence, using his power. He gets to a point where he becomes the chief advisor to King Ar-Pharazôn, and he's pushing them ever more in the direction that they were already going. He gets a temple. He persuades them to erect a temple to Morgoth, which is the heresy to the elves, to the Valar. They chop down the white tree, Nimloth, which was a gift again from the Blessed Realm, and drip by drip, the situation gets even worse, and to the point where he says to Ar-Pharazôn, "You know what? This is unfair. That the elves should live forever. That the undying realms are not available to you. You should build a navy and go and invade it. And you could be in the Undying Lands, and then you could live forever." Now, this is twisting the truth hugely, of course. Tolkien is very clear that the Undying Lands, it's not that if you go there, suddenly you live forever. It's that the lands themselves are undying, and so it is the natural home for those who are undying. If humans go there, it is not the right place for them, and it would feel as if their lives kind of like flash before their eyes, because everything is eternal except them. But that, by the by, that's the real situation. But Sauron is manipulating it, and he gets Pharazôn to build, it's called the Great Armament, this massive fleet, and he puts his army onto the fleet, and they sail west. The faithful, led at this point by Elendil, realize this is not going to go well. They manage to save what they can from Númenor, get onto ships, and head out to sea. And when the Great Armament reaches the Blessed Realm, Eru himself personally intervenes, and he destroys the fleet. And not only that, but he destroys Númenor itself. This is, Tolkien often referred to Númenor as Númenor Atlantis, because this is the Atlantis myth is built up into this conception that he's got here. And this great wave takes over, washes over Númenor, and it sinks beneath the sea. Everyone dies, except for those who were in those ships, Elendil's ships, off the coast, and Sauron, who is a Maya, and so his physical body is destroyed, but his spirit heads back to Mordor, and he slowly rebuilds himself. Now, to follow that up very quickly, that takes a long period of time, but he does. But he has lost the ability, because of this is a god event that caused the doom of Númenor. That meant that he lost the ability to choose the physical form that he had. So he had to take on a form which was reflective of who he was, as this kind of like Dark Lord. So that is the form that we have. And Tolkien does give a little bit of a description of it, but I love the Peter Jackson films, when you get that sort of flashback thing right at the very beginning. That's how I imagine Sauron anyway. So he's gone back to Mordor, slowly building himself back up to power, and over the course of a century or a bit more, Elendil and his two sons land in Middle-earth. They get separated in the Great Storm. Elendil heads up to the north, founds Arnor, the Great Kingdom in the north. Isildur, with his brother, established Gondor in the south. And Elendil is the High King. They have the Palantiri, so they do, although they are separated, they can talk to each other. Elendil, it's agreed he's the High King, he's the father, and then Gondor is an independent kingdom, but Elendil's their High King. They have 100 years or more to be establishing that kingdom, at which point Sauron tries again. He's got rid of Númenor, and he can see that Gondor and Arnor are strong. They're perhaps not as strong as Númenor was, because they're just the remnants, but they still have some of the kind of the magical technology left over. So he attacks. He takes Minas Ithil, which later will be known as Minas Morgul, which was the seat of Isildur. Isildur heads off to see his dad and say, "Please come help." There's this siege of Minas Anor, which is later known as Minas Tirith, but the elves and the men answer the call for help from Isildur, and we get the last alliance of elves and men, which is led by Elendil and Gil-galad, the two high kings. And so they head down and push Sauron back to Mordor, and we get this siege of Barad-dûr, which lasts for 7 years. The elves and the humans, they're besieging Sauron in Barad-dûr, and eventually Sauron has enough, and he comes out personally with a kind of a counterattack, and he takes on the two kings. And this sounds like it's this amazingly epic battle. He kills them, but in killing them, he too is vanquished. And that's when we get this moment when Isildur gets the hilt of Narsil, the famous sword, and cuts it from Sauron's hand, and Sauron is vanquished. So that is the Second Age. We obviously know what happens next with Isildur, but that's the Second Age. I've got some questions from my patrons that I will work my way through. I should say though, this is pre-recorded, but I know that the moderators will be there. If you are watching this live, hi. Great to see you. The moderators, I'm sure, are doing a fantastic job, as they always do. Could you just show a little bit of love to the moderators, because they are incredibly wonderful. Thank you hugely. And while I'm doing my thanks, I'd like to also thank my patrons. Your support means everything to me. Not just because it helps me do what I do, but also just on a very personal level. I'm hugely grateful that you want to support what we're doing here. It's fantastic. Thank you. One other small advert, I should say, is it an advert? I don't know. Something else that I'm doing is, I mentioned this the last couple of weeks. I have set up a new channel. You might be watching or listening to this actually on the new channel right now, In Deep Sleep. The idea is, so many people have told me over the years that they use these live streams, in particular my other videos, to get to sleep, which I've decided to embrace. I think that's fantastic. If I know a lot of people struggle to get to sleep, and if this helps, then that is fantastic. So the idea is that the audio for these live streams, I will, a little bit after they've happened, I will put that into a video without my face, but with some kind of like soothing, good visual and background noise. So the first couple I did had a crackling fire going. People have said that they'd love the sound of maybe rainfall against a window pane or something like that, maybe some waves crashing on a beach, that kind of thing. So the audio plays, the live stream, you can listen to it just like a podcast, but when I finish talking, then the great background noise will just carry on. And that can carry on for as long as you want it to. So that's the idea. I'm not going to put adverts in the middle of that. So that's you can rest assured that you're not going to be rudely awakened by an advert in the middle of one of those. So if you are there in Deep Sleep, Hi. I hope that these are working for you and you get a good night's sleep. If you're not, if you're watching these over here on the main IDG Live, then if that's something you're interested in, go and take a look. There should be a link down in the description somewhere. Okay, so let's go to some questions from my patrons. Ranabir Mitra saying, "Salutations, Robert and Dan the dog. I hope you are well." We are, thank you very much. Sauron started building Barad-dûr at about 1,000, the year 1,000 of the Second Age. But what was he doing till then? The Rings of Power TV show had him be a gooey plasma for 1,000 years, but for sure that was not the case, because he would have needed a huge army of Easterlings, Haradrim, and Orcs to even start the constructions in Mordor. It's pure speculation, I know, but what do you think he was doing? Yes, so this is speculation because Tolkien specifically does not tell us. And this is one of those things that even proper Tolkien academics will say, okay, well, we've got some ideas, but this is a deliberate gap left. So what we do know is that at the very beginning of the Second Age, Sauron repented, as it were, and then changed his mind and went off into hiding. The extent to which he actually, I think I did a video on this as well, actually, but the extent to which he actually repented is kind of open to question. But the clear implication is that he certainly realised that he'd been beaten. The extent to which he felt contrite for his actions is perhaps slightly more up for debate. But he headed off, and for 500 years he was in hiding. And that is basically, he didn't do much. He lay low. He was waiting to see what was going on. And this is understandable because he had just escaped from the most powerful, cataclysmic, earth-shattering war imaginable. The War of Wrath saw Morgoth, the most powerful of the Valar, if you like, just defeated as the entire army of the Valar came in for decades, and the war was so catastrophic on many levels, not just physical fighting, but clearly there's a whole load of kind of magical stuff going on, that an entire area of land, an entire corner of a continent got decimated and destroyed and sunk. He has escaped from that. He has escaped from the most powerful beings imaginable who are after him, and he's not 100% sure that they've stopped looking for him. Certainly, the elves who stayed were aware of him, and if they weren't actively hunting for him, then they will have been keeping an eye out for him. So 500 years or so, we hear nothing. The clear implication, he's somewhere off to the east in hiding. Then around 500 or so, and then a little bit later, we get Sauron seemingly starting to move. A bit after that is when Gil-galad writes to the king of Númenor to say, "I can sense that there's a shadow rising off to the southeast." So during this period, he's not, as far as we can tell, on the map of Middle-earth that we know, but he's off to the east, off to the south. And what is he doing? Well, I think he's preparing the ground. He's still in hiding. He's not sort of revealed himself to be Sauron, but he's preparing the ground so that he has supporters there. Remember that this is the part of Middle-earth who were supporters of Morgoth back in the day. And so he is making sure that they will support him, as he is now starting to come to the conclusion that the Valar have gone. They've abandoned Middle-earth. And he started to come to the conclusion that Middle-earth is just full of chaos and it just needs a little bit of order. And who's going to sort this out? Well, he's the most powerful person here. It should be him. He's the person best placed to do this. How is he going to do that? He hasn't figured out his plan entirely yet, but he's laying the groundwork. So that is how I imagine that he was to start with, making sure that those parts of Middle-earth that previously supported Morgoth were then going to easily fall in behind him when he did declare himself. Then, at around the year 1000, he starts scanning what's going on further, realizes that this isn't as he originally thought. This wasn't just a matter of the elves. The humans are starting on Númenor. They're starting to get a little bit powerful. And he thinks, you know what? I need a home base. And that's when he sets himself up in Mordor, and that's when he starts building Barad-dûr. Mara Lee, what was the role of Galadriel during the Second Age, especially leading up to the last alliance of elves and men? And Arana Mitra also saying, asking what Galadriel and Celeborn were doing during the last alliance of elves and men. Their history is famously the most peculiar, but can we hypothesize something using the information we have about them before and after the war? Right. So, Ranabir, yes, famously the most, I can't remember the exact word you used, but this is what Christopher Tolkien, and there's a chapter in Unfinished Tales which is about the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. And this is how he starts. He says, there is no part, having looked across all of his father's notes, he says, there is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. And it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions. Or to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings. So what he then goes on to do, if you've got Unfinished Tales, it's a fascinating read. What Christopher goes on to do in that chapter is try to piece together what he calls the different traditions, what can we see and say about what happens with Galadriel and Celeborn. It's clear that she grew in importance in Tolkien's mind through his lifetime. She didn't start as being particularly important. When he got to writing The Lord of the Rings, she started going up a few notches. By the end of his life, she was suddenly very important in the history of Middle-earth. And a lot of this means that you get these different angles to her story, that you have to decide, if you're going through this, which version do we go with? And sometimes we're left with these actually slightly awkward decisions when we're digging through the deep weeds of Tolkien's work and say, well, do we go with what was published in The Lord of the Rings, because we know that that's what Tolkien thought when and published, so he was clearly happy with it, or do we go with a different version that 20 years or so later he wrote a few different sort of small essays on these different things that kind of contradicts what it says in Lord of the Rings. So we get different traditions about what's happening. In particular, what role did she play in the rebellion of the Noldor? Therefore, was she seen as one of the key ringleaders, or did she just go along with this because she wanted to go over to Middle-earth? What does this mean about the Valar at the end of the First Age? Was she invited back to the Undying Lands? Or did the Valar say, no, you're still banned? We get different versions of this. When did she meet Celeborn? Did she meet Celeborn? Was Celeborn over in sort of the west side of the ocean? Did she meet him before she left the Blessed Realm? Or did she meet him afterwards in Doriath when she arrives over in Middle-earth? There's lots of different versions of this kind of floating around. But we can kind of try and pick through this to a very high-level understanding of what she and Celeborn were up to during the Second Age. So she certainly starts, the two of them certainly seem to start over in Lindon. She decided to stay, whatever the situation was she decided she wanted to stay in Middle Earth, and because she wanted to rule lands of her own. That there's a pride to Galadriel as a kind of a guiding factor here that is quite important. In all of the traditions is quite important in understanding who she was. There's not so much of a sort of an anger or look for vengeance or anything like this. There's a pride about her, a wanting to rule. So she starts out in Lindon with High King Gil-galad, and she's not disputing the fact that he is the High King, but she wants to rule stuff of her own. And she and Celeborn, they go off to a couple of places sort of close by, kind of ruling under Gil-galad's leadership, but ruling their own little areas. They seem to end up in Eregion, which is where Celebrimbor was. And they are there for a little while. When Anatar arrives, she doesn't trust him. As one of the wise, she's there going, I don't know who this person is. As far as we can tell, she did not know who Sauron was exactly, but she didn't trust him. Celebrimbor, however, seems to have ignored her in some way, and she eventually decides that she's heading off. She and Celeborn, by this point, have got a daughter, Galadriel, and she heads off east to explore new lands. And she goes through Khazad-dûm. She's absolutely fine with the dwarves. Celeborn, her husband, has a thing against dwarves. Let's put it that way. You can see this all the way through into the Lord of the Rings. He's the one who was there giving the orders about Gimli's not allowed in and things like that. He does not like dwarves. Galadriel's fine. She heads through Khazad-dûm to the other side, and she ends up in the lands that we know as Lothlorien. They are not called Lothlorien at that point, and she's not ruling them at that point, but she kind of sets up camp there. After Anatar has gone, and back to Mordor, as Sauron forges the One Ring, Celebrimbor goes, "What have I done?" He heads off. He finds Galadriel and says, and remember, this in the books, this isn't just like compacted into a matter of a few days or weeks. We've got decades here, and in this time, he heads off to Galadriel and says, "What do I do with these rings?" He gives her one of those rings, and she keeps that from that moment forward, all the way through the rest of the story. Anyway, she stays in Lothlorien. Celebrimbor heads back. He distributes those 3 rings. He heads back to Eregion. Sauron invades. Celeborn seems to still be there on the western side of the mountains. Galadriel and Celeborn's relationship seems good and strong, but they also seem to be okay with staying a few centuries apart from each other every now and then. He is part of the resistance fighting against Sauron. Galadriel doesn't seem to get involved at that point. But when Sauron gets pushed back, she does head back west of the mountains, meet up again with Celeborn, and they seem to spend a little bit of time, first of all, in Rivendell. So they seem to have been there sort of for the establishment of Rivendell when Elrond sets up Rivendell. And we're told, though, that she then started to get the sea longing, which is something that the elves get. This is the call to head west. She did not want to head west. She felt that, Tolkien writes later, that she felt that she shouldn't go until Sauron had been dealt with. But clearly also she still wanted to be ruling lands. So she's sort of hanging on in Middle-earth, but they go to the seaside. They head off to Belfalas, which we know later as Dol Amroth, which was sort of on what will be the coast of Gondor. And as far as we can tell, they spend the rest of the Second Age there. We don't hear about them at all in the War of the Last Alliance of Elves and Men. Does that mean that they weren't involved? I would find it hard to believe. certainly Celeborn had been involved in fighting against Sauron before. I see absolutely no reason why he wouldn't be involved in fighting against Sauron again. Galadriel, although she had been a warrior of Amazon disposition, as Tolkien calls her, in her younger days, she does very much seem, once she's got to Middle-earth, to be starting this transformation into the figure that we see in The Lord of the Rings, who isn't out there fighting everybody, but she's sort of staying behind and providing the help. So I don't know. My instinct is that probably she stayed there and was behind the scene doing roughly what she was doing in The Lord of the Rings, providing help and support, whereas Celeborn probably did go and join the battle. We just didn't read about it. I think if she had been there in that battle, probably Tolkien would have told us. Celeborn, slightly less central figure, let's face it, so I can certainly imagine that he could have been in that battle and Tolkien not mention it, because he doesn't give it. Tolkien does not linger over battles in a way that perhaps some other writers do. He will tell us what happens. He will give us sort of headlines of kind of troop movements and things like that, but he doesn't kind of glory in the battle itself. So we don't know, is the short answer. We do not know what they were up to during that time, but probably, I think, she stayed in Belfalas and supported from behind the lines. He probably got engaged in the battle itself. Alexander the Just Okay. Hey Robert, I hope you're well. I am, thank you. Not particular to this subject, but I'm curious. How critical or awesome is it to read the history of Middle-earth? I've read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Patron and Luthien, Children of Húrin, Fall of Gondolin, Fall of Númenor, and Unfinished Tales. How much am I missing? And based on the fact I loved all of these, what could I expect from those books? Okay, so for those who do not know the history of Middle-earth, we get... obviously, during Tolkien's lifetime, we get published The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and he left huge amounts of other stuff. He was trying desperately to be writing the Silmarillion, didn't quite manage to finish it. Christopher Tolkien picked up where his father left off and managed to get that published. Then we have various other things that he's sort of over time picked out and said, okay, well, we can publish this. Unfinished Tales, I think, is a fantastic read. It's basically just a selection of stuff from Tolkien, that mini essays. There's the Mariner's Wife, which I mentioned, this story from the Second Age, a sort of a long bit of prose. We get some histories of descriptions of Númenor, stuff like that. A mini essay on the Palantiri, for example. Lots of different things going on there. We get the three great stories, Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, Fall of Gondolin, but all of that is kind of like the stuff that you could present as more sort of easy access is probably the wrong way of saying it, but that's how it is. These are the actual stories. Behind that, there's a wealth of other things that Tolkien, he worked on this over his entire life. So you get, and when you start reading through what Christopher Tolkien says, you have this incredible collection, because Tolkien didn't throw much away, this incredible collection that he was working through of drafts of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, different versions, one after another with slight changes. You get sort of an essay here, you get a letter he wrote to someone over there, you get some scribbled notes on the back of an envelope, which you get some where he writes things like barely decipherable, rubbed out and crossed over, but I think it says this. So that kind of real treasure trove, but not in a huge amount of order. He did an amazing academic job over the course of 12 books, which we call as a whole the history of Middle-earth, to pull that together into some kind of order. So what we have is you get very broadly the first half or bit more of those books. They are dealing with the build-up, the old bits of writing that he did, which were absolutely fascinating, which aren't necessarily all of them. Some of them are very related. You get poems that he wrote, early poems that he wrote about Elendil and things like that. You also get half finished stories that he did. Digression. He had, we all know, this great friendship with C.S. Lewis, and at one point they just had one of these. Sounds like it was a pub conversation where they're saying, "Oh, it's really annoying. There aren't many people writing the kind of stories that we like to read," and then they said, "Well, why don't we write them?" And they kind of like tossed a coin or something and decided one person had to write a science fiction story, the other person had to write a time travel story, and Lewis got the science fiction story and Tolkien got the time travel story. Lewis was a lot more organized than Tolkien, and he went off, and that is what turned into Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, that Hideous Strength. If you know those stories, you'll know them very well. That's where that emerged from. Tolkien, a lot less organized, not very good at finishing things that he starts, but he did start writing this story, the Notion Club papers, which would end up bringing the characters to Atlantis as a time travel story. And this was him trying to get out. He had this recurring dream about Atlantis and the Great Wave crashing. And this was him trying to sort of get this out, exorcise this out onto paper. And that formed the basis for his thinking on Númenor. And he's very clear that this is where this comes from. So you can read stuff like that in there. I actually happen to have here, just because I have had this just while I was starting to record this, I had this by my hand. This is the 12th volume called The Peoples of Middle-earth. And so as a sort of a very sort of high overview of the kinds of things that's in here. So, for example, what we've got is sections here about family trees, about the calendars that are used, the heirs of Elendil. Then we've got some late writings about dwarves and men, some sort of like more esoteric stuff going on there. That's an essay about Lembas, and then we also get right at the very end of this. You also get the New Shadow, which is that I did a video on this as well. If you're interested. His attempt to write a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. He only ever got 13 pages in before abandoning it for various reasons. But that's the kind of thing you get in here. The feel is a lot more mixed than most of the other stuff you've got. So it's a big variety of things. And it feels a lot more academic. So it's not just, here's some stuff that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote. It's like, it's Christopher Tolkien playing an active role as editor and explainer. He is interpreting what we've got. He is telling us, at this time he said this, and at this time he said this. I think how this fits together is here. Here is some stuff which didn't ever really seem to go anywhere with like a timeline of this. That's the kind of thing you will find in it. If you are an absolute Tolkien nerd, then you will love the History of Middle-earth series. If you just want the stories, I would say this is one of the things that towards the end of your Tolkien journey. Let's put it that way. Commander Ray, why did Sauron focus on the elves the way he did? I understand the logic of it all, but surely he would be smart enough to sense that men was a rising power and the elves fading. The dwarves could be tricked to mind their own, at least, until he wanted to conquer them. But men, and in particular breaking Númenor and leading to its destruction, was the greatest play Sauron ever made. I posit that he should have from the onset focused on men, twisting them, even crafting the rings to this purpose, even if he had to work with the elves for this. I just find his approach extremely flawed. After all, we see that this idea basically worked when the Witch King spent most of the Third Age weakening men. What do you think? If Sauron managed to focus on men first, even perhaps with the Rings of Power? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's a good question. I think the thing to point out, I think, is, or actually to do, is to try and, if we wish to, as best we can, get into Sauron's mind on this. He was, as we said, in hiding for the first 500 years or so. Then the next 500 years or so, as far as we can tell, he did focus on humanity in the majority of Middle-earth, but it's on the bit of the map that we don't really know about or talk about. So that's what he first did, and he found humans are easy to deal with. What he thought was the real threat was the elves. Now, the elves, yes, by the end of the Third Age, when we're reading the Lord of the Rings, they are a very diminished force. At this point, they're not what they once were, but still, they are very powerful and capable, in the right circumstances, of making things like those 3 rings of power that Celebrimbor did. So what he did was focus in on what he thought was, at the time, the biggest threat. He was not unaware of Númenor, it has to be said. Númenor kept to itself for the first few hundred years, but we read that when he established himself in Mordor in the year 1000, it was with half an eye on Númenor. He was aware that they were a rising power. At the time, though, they weren't really expanding out beyond Númenor. So geopolitically, his thinking was, well, I've got the east and the south sorted. That bit's okay. Númenor, I can probably leave them be for the moment. I'm concerned about them. I'm wary of them. But I don't have to prioritize them. The priority are the elves, because the elves will remember who I am. The elves are incredibly powerful, and the elves will definitely try and get me. I've actually got the quote here from when he's setting up in around the year 1000. He's setting up, or started working on Barad-dûr, setting himself up in Mordor. This is what we read. News of these things, which is the elves' growing strength in the west, came to the ears of Sauron and increased the fears that he felt concerning the coming of the Númenorians to Lindon and the coasts further south, and their friendship with Gil-galad. And he heard tell also of Aldarion, son of Tar-Meneldir, the king of Númenor, now become a great shipwright, who brought his vessels to haven far down into the Harad. Sauron therefore left Eriador alone for a while, and he chose the land of Mordor, as it was afterwards called, for a stronghold as a counter to the threat of the Númenorian landings. So he was aware of Númenor. He was concerned about the idea of Númenor and the elves having a strong alliance. And his response was, I will build myself a stronghold, which is there near-ish Númenor. Númenor is obviously a long way off the coast, but they were starting to create some settlements sort of along that coast near to Mordor, Pelargir and Harad and places like that. So he established his base, and then he had to decide, who am I going to deal with first? I'll deal with the elves. So what if he'd gone to Númenor first? Númenor at the time, it has to be said, probably it would have been a lot harder to corrupt them. So if we're trying to defend Sauron's approach, it kind of made sense. The elves were going to stay the same level of incorruptibility all the way through. The Númenorians, they descended. They were going to be very hard to start with. Don't forget that their first king was Elros, the brother of Elrond. He was a half elf. He had Maya blood as well, so he was actually pretty powerful. And he lived for the first 300-400 years of Númenor. So the Númenor was of increased strength, but morally going down, and so Sauron targeted them when they were more easily corrupted. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's I absolutely understand why, but I think it's the key points are he did target humans first, I think, in the east and the south. Then he decided that he wanted to set himself up a base against the potential Númenorian strength. Then he decided to go after the elves. So it's not a matter of him just going straight for the elves and ignoring humanity. He did deal with humanity, and then he tried to deal with the elves. Matthew Martell, I'd be interested in knowing what you think the extent of Númenorian exploration and settlement was. Also, and this has been covered to some extent before, what do you think that the Blue Wizards got up to, assuming that we go with their arrival in the Second Age as canon? Well, in terms of the Númenor exploration and settlements, we're basically told that they over time settled. Basically, if you imagine Middle Earth, you see that sort of curve that we've got along the sort of the south coast of Gondor, and then heading down into Harad Umbar, that kind of place. That was where they settled. Pelagia was a port that they established. That's at the mouth of the river Anduin. Pardon me. They also Harad and Umbar. The Black Númenorians. This is the area in Harad and Umbar was populated by what are called Black Númenorians. This was black because they are evil. So they're the bad ones whereas Pelagia largely was set up by and kept by the faithful. It was the king's men who established the other parts, and so that is why it was very easy for them to become rivals of Gondor in time. So they never really got too far inland, but along the coastal regions, they managed to establish quite a lot of fortifications. As for the two blue wizards, this is again one of those things that Tolkien seems to have changed his mind on. He was very clear that the Istari, the five wizards, arrived in the Third Age around the year 1000. The Blue Wizards headed off east, and then he's gone on record as saying that he doesn't really know what they did, but they probably fell eventually. But we get a few other little tidbits from him, again, that Christopher Tolkien dug out, that say that they got sent along with Glorfindel, who Tolkien eventually came to the conclusion that Glorfindel had to have arrived in the Second Age, not the Third Age. So they and Glorfindel got sent in the Second Age to help against Sauron, and we're told that their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and after his first fall, to search out his hiding, in which they failed, and to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. So they were sent relatively early to try and find him and to try and help those people in the East who hadn't been a part of this, who had support of Morgoth Melkor. And he goes on to say, there must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of East, who would both in the Second Age and Third Age otherwise have outnumbered the West, which is worth pointing out. We often think of Blue Wizards as not really being very effective, but what Tolkien's saying is that for all of this talk that the East and the South were bigger than the bits of Middle Earth that we know about, with more people, there has to be a reason why not all of those people fell in behind Sauron. And the reason why is because the Blue Wizards were doing their job. So he goes on. Thus it was that though as soon as Sauron's disguise was pierced and he was recognized as an enemy, he exerted all his time and strength to gathering and training armies. This is after the Rings of Power has been forged. He's got the One Ring, and then he realizes that the plan hasn't worked, and he wants to go and invade Eregion. And there's a gap. You'll remember there was a gap of, 90-odd years? There was a gap there before he actually does the invasion. And that's not just Tolkien having long periods of time for no reason. The reason was that he thought he could get an army and go, but he couldn't, because the Blue Wizards were working in secret to kind of prevent that. So we read here, he exerted all his time and strength, this is Sauron, to gathering and training armies, but it took some 90 years before he felt ready to open war. And he misjudged this, as we see in his final defeat, when the great host of Minas Tirith from Númenor landed in Middle-earth. His gathering of armies had not been unopposed, and his success had been much less than his hope. But this is a matter spoken of in notes on the Five Wizards. He had powerful enemies behind his back, the east, and in the southern lands, to which he had not yet given sufficient thought. So basically, we're told that the Blue Wizards here worked through the Second Age. Every time Sauron's trying to build up an army, he's getting frustrated because he can't do it as quickly as he would like to, because the Blue Wizards are doing their work. So that's what we think they're up to. And so they head back. It would appear after the Second Age, they head back to the Blessed Realm. And when Manwë decides to send them off again, this is the logical choice. You did a good job last time. You should go back, but I'm going to send more this time. Stephen, hi, Robert. Were there any dragons that are known to have been around during the Second Age? Were any of them in league with Sauron? Well, the dragons that we have, so dragons were created by Morgoth in the First Age. So allegedly is this kind of mockery of the great eagles, but the first great dragon, Glaurung, he didn't have wings. Then we get Ancalagon, who did have wings, massive dragon. That dragon was destroyed during the War of Wrath. However, there were others, and some of them, it would appear, did survive. As I said right at the very beginning, one of the key points about the beginning of the Second Age is that those who had been fighting on Morgoth's side, most were defeated. However, some scattered. And some of those who scattered were the dragons. And the dragons went off, it would appear, to the northeast. They went to broadly a place we know as the Northern Waste, the Withered Heath, which is sort of near the Grey Mountains, which is sort of, if you're imagining kind of north of the Lonely Mountain, the Misty Mountains, and sort of head east from there. That's where they all seem to have gone. And what happened to them? Well, they just kind of stayed where they were, because this was safe from the powers that had been defeating them back at the end of the First Age. But slowly over time, they seem to have gained more confidence and sort of pushed out further and further. And so I mentioned those 7 dwarf rings. 4 of them dragons got because they smelt out these kind of great dwarven hoards of gold and other precious things that they dug up from the ground, and they went on the attack. 4 different of these kind of dwarf great piles of cash, and were taken by dragons. And in that, the rings that the king of that tribe wore were taken, swallowed, and destroyed. So only 3 were left. And then, of course, ultimately in the Third Age, we get Smaug, who also goes hunting and gets to Erebor. and kicks out the dwarves from there. So that's it. In terms of were any in league with Sauron, I think, although we don't know the detailed history of these dragons, so we can't say for certain, I think we have to go with the relationship that Smaug and Sauron seem to have had, which is that Gandalf was very clear. We get, actually, this is an unfinished tales, if you're interested. We get Gandalf explaining his thinking behind the plan for the Hobbit. What was he trying to achieve? How did he go about trying to do it? One of the things is that he kind of starts out pondering the geopolitical situation in northern Middle Earth and saying Smaug's a big problem. We really need to get rid of Smaug. Pardon me. So when I lost my train of thought there. What was I talking about? Were they in league with Sauron? So when he's starting to think about Smaug, he doesn't think this is somebody who's reporting to Sauron, but he thinks that they kind of have shared objectives, as it were. And Sauron will want to use Smaug and give him the support to do the things that Smaug would naturally want to do, but Sauron will be very happy for him to do this. So this seems to be a kind of a strategy that Sauron has with powerful other beings. He has a similar thing going on with Shelob. Shelob lives just on the borders of Mordor. Sauron's very aware of that and is okay with it, and does not at any point, it would appear, try to control Shelob because they've got an understanding. She can eat lots of his orcs, but she's also guarding that way into Mordor. And it's the same going on here with Smaug, is that Smaug was in no way working for Sauron. But if Sauron kind of nudged him, then he would happily go out and start ravaging more of the sort of the north of Middle-earth. So that's the kind of feel, and I think we have to take that and go, that's probably how those Second Age dragons were. I don't think any of them were under Sauron's control, but maybe they were. Some of the smaller ones, who knows? But we don't hear that they were, and probably he was just okay with them having sort of shared objectives with him. Ranebe Mitra, how did Gil-galad, Círdan, Celebrimbor, and the elves who were based in the havens of Sirion in Beleriand find themselves in Lindon at the beginning of the Second Age? Forgive me for the jest here, but did Eonwë just wait for them to cross the Blue Mountains, and then he asked the Valar to split and sink Beleriand after that? On a serious note, what do you think happened during this time after the War of Wrath? Okay, so this is the end of the First Age leading into the Second Age. The War of Wrath itself was hugely destructive, and most of the elves, by the time that came, they'd actually been pushed out of most of Beleriand, and they were just gathered around, as you say, the havens of Sirion, that just these small enclaves, islands, right towards the south. And then the war happened. And the war took 40 years. And the war itself was the thing which did the destruction of the land. We read Encalagon, the dragon that I was talking about before, the first and greatest flying dragon. When he fell, then he fell and destroyed the three mountains of that sort of formed the pinnacle of Morgoth's home base. That's literal earth-shattering stuff. So my general feel is that by the time we get to the end, and Tolkien doesn't tell us this in any detail at all, but by the time we get to the end of this, we've had 40 years of fighting. The elves are probably just trying to stay out of the way of these mega powerful beings fighting each other. And so it's not a matter of everything was fine and the war was done, and then Eonwë said, right, we're now going to sink this land. Do you want to get out? The land was being destroyed before their eyes, and so they kind of made their way over the Blue Mountains into Lindon. I'm sure there would have been a bit, and at the end, then yes, it was a final destruction of it all and a drowning of it all. But this took place over a long period of time. So I think it's not just a matter of Eonwë saying, "Okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to stay here and sink, or do you want to go away?" It was a natural movement as much as anything else. And Eonwë also, during this time, was giving people the option to go back to the Undying Land. The elves there, he was saying, and a lot of them took him up on it, do you want to sail west? So this wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't just like a click your fingers and make your decision kind of thing. This was a sort of a movement in both directions. In reading The Nature of Middle-earth, it is implied that when the elves are rebodied, they retain their memories. Can you elaborate on how this works? Yeah, happily. So The Nature of Middle-earth is, I showed you the volume 12 of the history of Middle-earth. Somewhere over here, I've got The Nature of Middle-earth as well. This is basically volume 13 of the history of Middle-earth. But this is not Christopher Tolkien, because Christopher Tolkien obviously sadly passed away a few years ago. This is another academic, a guy called Carl Hostetter, who has carried on this work. He's got access to Tolkien's papers, and he's gone through, and there are some more things that can be brought out. And it's perhaps even more than the 12 books of the history of Middle-earth. This is quite scattergun, lots of different things going on. But it's an excellent read nonetheless. The question you're asking about elves retaining their memories when they're rebodied, how does that work? It's an interesting one, because Tolkien goes into this is like the nature of Middle-earth, the name of the book, but it's like, how do things work? What is the nature of an elf? How is an elf like an elf is? And Tolkien thought about this. It sort of, at times, it kind of veers into a kind of like a more kind of a theological kind of feel. But he says that basically you get beings who are called incarnates, who are elves and humans, for example. They, by their nature, have two parts to who they are. They have their Fea, which is their kind of their spirit, their soul, and they have their Hoa, which is their body. And they work when you have both. You need both in order to be fully an elf or a human. You need not just your body, but your spirit, your soul. If one goes, then the other can't properly exist without it. The way that the elves talk about it, they talk about a house and an indweller. So that the body is the house, and then the indweller is the spirit or the soul. So the idea here is you get some beings which are naturally spiritual. Just to deal with this first. So the Valar, they're just spiritual beings. They can inhabit a body, but they don't need to in order to be truly who they are. So Gandalf inhabits a human body as Gandalf, but his natural state is spirit. And he's not less Gandalf if he's spirit, or Alorin, as his name is there. But when we get incarnates like elves, then they have to have both of these. Now, when humans die, their spirit goes somewhere. The body dies, and the spirit goes somewhere. And this is a great mystery in Tolkien's world, because it's like humans are not bound to Arda. When they die, their spirit goes somewhere. And the elves see this as a great release. This is a great blessing. But humans, understandably, don't necessarily see it this way. And this is a big theme in the Second Age, is that there's a clear misunderstanding, is that humans start to get frustrated. We die, the elves don't. And the elves are there going, we're tied to this place. We cannot leave. When your body dies, you can go. You can leave. This is your blessing. This is a good thing. And humans go, nope, we're just dying. And you're living forever. And so there's a complete misunderstanding about what's going on there. But humans, their body dies. In Tolkien's world, their spirit heads off. Elves, if their body dies, their spirit is still bound to Arda. So the spirit stays there. And it goes to the halls of Mandos, and then it can be rebodied. So, for example, classic example is Glorfindel, who dies in the First Age. His spirit goes to the halls of Mandos. It gets rebodied, and then he gets sent back in the Second Age to go and help out people again. Now, he has the memories, as you say. I mean, this is sort of the long way round to what you were first asking. How do rebodied elves retain their memories? Because their spirit, their soul has not died. It's just their body. And so if you give them a new body, it's like that house indweller thing. The indweller, the person, goes from a house which is burnt down into a new house, and they retain their memories. So that's the kind of the idea. As I say, Tolkien does get quite theological in a lot of this, but he thinks his way through it, and you have to sometimes, it's because he has his own language terms for things. So he talks about thea and hroa. We think of them as being spirit and body, but this just adds an extra layer of complexity on there. SNPY. I've always wondered something about when the Númenorians captured Sauron. Did he have the ring with him? If not, where was it? If yes, what happened to the ring when Númenor and Sauron was destroyed? Excellent question. And the answer is yes, he did have his ring with him. And because he's a Maya, he's one of these, sort of following on from what we were just talking about, he is a natural spiritual being, and he brought it back with him as a spirit, because his body died, his spirit is still there. Then he took it back to Mordor, and then sort of reconstructed a body for himself. The way Tolkien explains, how is that? How can a spirit take back a ring? The way Tolkien describes it, I'll read it, but I think the headline of this is that he recognizes that this is quite hard to get your head around. But bear with me. It's basically what he says. So he writes this: Sauron was first defeated, because he was asked in a letter, and so he tries to explain this. Sauron was first defeated by a miracle, a direct action of God the Creator, changing the fashion of the world when appealed to by Manwë. That's the destruction of Númenor. So, a God event. Though reduced to a spirit of hatred born on a dark wind, I do not think one need boggle at this spirit carrying off the One Ring, upon which his power of dominating minds now largely depended. So that's the kind of the headline, is that there was this god event which destroyed his body, but his spirit obviously is still there, and Tolkien thinks it's entirely explicable that this spiritual being, because the ring it's not just a bit of metal, it is part of him, and he has poured himself into this ring. And so Tolkien thinks, this makes sense that he can bring this across with him. But he adds elsewhere, another layer of detail, if you want. As I say, he goes into Tolkien has so many layers of these details. He says the Eldar held that spirits, the more as they had the more native inherent power, could emit their influence to make contact with or act upon things exterior to themselves, primarily upon other spirits or other incarnate persons via their fear, but also in the case of great spirits such as the Valar or the Greater Maiar, Sauron example here, directly upon physical things without the mediacy of bodies normally necessary. To describe this, but by deliberate symbolism, taken e.g. from such cases as their breathing upon a cold or frosted surface, which was then melted. In addition, Manwë, the most powerful spirit in Arda in this respect, was lord of air and winds, and the winds were in primitive Eldarin thought to be especially his emission of power for himself. Thus Thule, again using one of his own words, blowing forth, was used as to equal kind of spirit in this special sense, the emission of power or of will or desire from a spirit. Now, that's quite dense, but basically what he is saying is that great spirits can impact on physical things, and powerful spirits can impact directly on physical things without them having a physical body themselves. And the more powerful you are, the better you can do this. And so he's kind of like saying, so Manwë sort of blows wind. He's got like that, and then the wind sort of goes from him, and that's the kind of feel. This is not a he's not saying don't literally think of it like that, but it's a bit like that. Imagine like the cold leaving frost on a window. That's the kind of feel we've got going on here. To a lesser extent, an example that I think we have here is that ring wraiths clearly can interact with the physical world. So being spiritual, being a soul that does not have a body, does not mean necessarily that you cannot impact on the world. So this is sort of like a kind of an undercurrent that goes through a huge amount of what we got in Tolkien. The extent to which we get this, the elves later, when we hear about the possibility of elves fading. If elves didn't pass over to the Blessed Realm, they would eventually fade. And Tolkien doesn't use the word, but he basically says they become almost ghost-like, and they can have impacts on the world, but they have faded. So this is the answer. Sauron did have the ring with him, but he was such a powerful spirit that he could exude power. He could effectively be like blowing through spiritually. He could be blowing the ring with him across the ocean. So if you imagine a kind of like a visual of the Sauron's body dying, and then when we see the bodies of say Saruman dying, then like this kind of like spiritual mist rises up out of him, we read, and scouring the Shire. And so that, if you're getting this visual of that kind of thing, would happen Sauron on Númenor, and he would use that as power to be kind of pushing the ring off before him as he fled with his spirit to the east over towards Mordor. That's the kind of feel we've got going on here. Mara Lee, last question actually here. Mara Lee, hi there, Mara, by the way, saying, besides Elrond, which other main elves took part in the last alliance? We've already talked a little bit about Galadriel and Celeborn. We are not told about them, though. So the ones that we are told about them, we get specific mentions. Gil-galad is clearly there. Círdan and Elrond fought by his side. We also get, rather tragically, Oropher, who is Thranduil's father, so Legolas's granddad. Now, the Wood Elves of Greenwood, they didn't really want to get involved. They were living their nice, hippie lifestyle there in the forest. They didn't want to. They weren't great craftsmen. They didn't have great weapons of war. But they kind of, yeah, they valued their independence, but they kind of understood this last alliance of elves and men. They should get involved, and so Odofer gathers together some of his men, and he heads down with the host. Gil-galad's in charge, but Odofer was a very independent-minded person. And as they're reaching Mordor, Gil-galad's there sort of coming up with his plans, talking to people, discussing exactly how they're going to do it. And Odofer, with his very lightly armored guys, they, as I say, they're wood elves. They've got their bows. They got their the equivalent of soft leather armor on. He just heads off with them. He says, "Right, we're off. I'm not here following orders from anyone. We're heading off to fight the bad guys," and they go off before getting any orders from Gil-galad. And it is those they most of those die. It's a huge tragedy. Though most of those die, and it is them who we get in the Dead Marshes. When we get all those years later, when Frodo and Sam and Gollum head through the Dead Marshes, and then there's these sort of ghostly elves under the water, that's who it is that we're looking at. And then you get this extra kind of tragedy, which is kind of built in. Tolkien does not major on this, and you have to really dig to actually get this. But Thranduil then becomes the Lord of Mirkwood. It's not called Mirkwood at the time, it's still Greenwood the Great. And we're told that this was understandably traumatic for him. He lost his father and a huge amount of his people there. And we're told that he didn't even want to look south, because that's where it happened, this great tragedy, for fear of Sauron. And when you start to understand that he is basically traumatized by what happened, it suddenly makes a whole lot more sense how Sauron could, in the Third Age, establish himself in Dol Guldur as the necromancer, and slowly push his way with his forces further and further and further north through Greenwood the Great. And Thranduil doesn't really oppose him, and he doesn't ever really stop and go, I wonder who this guy is. It's because he's traumatized by the war and by Sauron and the stuff from the south. And that's why he just kind of like gives a bit of ground until Greenwood the Great turns into Mirkwood, and he and his kingdom, they're left in just this corner in the top of Mirkwood. So that's not the kind of thing that you get just from a quick reading of The Hobbit, but that's what you get when you start going into the background and the detail of all of this. Okay, so that was my my last question about the Second Age. Hopefully that was helpful for you if you've not really come across the Second Age in much detail before. As I said earlier, this will be appearing. In fact, if you're there, you might be listening to this over on In Deep Sleep. In which case, very soon we will start to fade away, and I don't know. Let's do some rain. I think we'll have some rain in the background for this one. But if you want to listen to this one again ad-free, then it's going to be over there on In Deep Sleep. Thank you, moderators. I'm obviously pre-recording this, so I can't see what's going on in the chat right now. But thank you. I'm sure you're doing a fantastic job, as always. If you are there in the chat, please do show a little bit of love to the moderators. Thank you, patrons. I hugely appreciate it. I will be back next week with another one of these. Probably we'll go back to a Song of Ice and Fire one, another one of the sort of the great mysteries of A Song of Ice and Fire. I haven't decided exactly which one we'll do next week, but we'll figure that one out when we get to it. But if you are watching this back a little bit later, appearing somewhere around here is going to be a link to more playlist, a playlist of more live streams. Appearing somewhere around here is a link to my Patreon, and I'm going to put a link somewhere in the middle here, probably just slap bang over my face, to In Deep Sleep. So take care, everyone, and I will see you same time next week.